Day in the life of an ancient Roman. 2. Work and money. Imagine waking up in ancient Rome with no savings, no bank account, no credit card, and no guarantee that you will earn enough money to survive the month. Your life depends on your work. For millions of people across the Roman world, this was reality. Rome was one of the largest cities of the ancient world, and its economy was enormous. Food arrived from distant provinces. Merchants crossed the Mediterranean. Workshops produced pottery, weapons, clothing, jewelry, furniture, and tools. Builders constructed houses, temples, roads, bridges, and public buildings. Thousands of people worked every day to keep the city alive. But Roman society was not an equal one. The work you did depended heavily on who you were, your family, your legal status, your wealth, your connections, and sometimes simply whether you were born free or enslaved. Most Romans had to work. The image of ancient Rome often focuses on emperors, senators, gladiators, and wealthy aristocrats. But they represented only a small part of Roman society. Most Romans were ordinary people: farmers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, construction workers, sailors, porters, bakers, fishermen, blacksmiths, carpenters, potters, butchers, and countless other workers. The Roman economy depended on them. A city like Rome could not survive without an enormous supply of food. Grain had to be harvested somewhere, transported to ports, loaded onto ships, sailed across the Mediterranean, unloaded, stored, processed, and finally distributed to the population. Every loaf of bread represented the work of dozens of people. The same was true for almost everything Romans used. A simple piece of clothing required someone to produce the fibers, spin the thread, weave the fabric, dye it, and finally turn it into a garment. A clay cup required a potter. A bronze lamp required a metalworker. A wooden table required a carpenter. Rome was a city powered by human labor. And there was something very different about Roman work compared with modern employment. There was no modern concept of a standard 9-to-5 job. Working hours depended on the season, profession, weather, and circumstances. Farmers followed the agricultural calendar. Shopkeepers might spend most of the day in their stores. Construction workers could work from sunrise until later in the day. Artisans worked in small workshops, and merchants could spend weeks or months traveling. For many Romans, work was not something they left behind at the end of the day. It was their entire life. The Roman shop was also a home. Walk through an ancient Roman street, and you would see something surprisingly familiar. Shops. Small businesses opened directly onto the street. A bakery, a wine shop, a food stall, a workshop, a butcher, a pottery store, a place selling tools, a place repairing shoes. The front of the building might be open toward the street, allowing customers to walk directly inside. Behind the shop could be a workshop. Above it could be living quarters. In some cases, the same family could live and work in the same building. Imagine a Roman shoemaker. He wakes up in the morning. His family is nearby. Below him is the workshop. Leather is spread across the floor. Tools hang from the walls. Customers arrive from the street. The shoemaker works throughout the day while his family helps with the business. There is no separate office, no commute, no company headquarters. The workplace and home are connected. This was common in many ancient economies, and Roman businesses could become surprisingly sophisticated. Some workshops employed multiple workers. Some were operated by freedmen. Others belonged to wealthy businessmen. A successful artisan could build a reputation. His name could become associated with quality. And some craftsmen even left behind inscriptions showing their pride in their profession. But not everyone working in Rome was free. Far from it. Slavery was everywhere. One of the most important and uncomfortable realities of Roman society was slavery. Enslaved people were legally considered property. They could be bought and sold. They could be forced to work in households, farms, mines, workshops, or other occupations. Their lives varied enormously depending on where they worked and who owned them. An enslaved person in a wealthy household might work as a cook, servant, teacher, secretary, or personal attendant. Another might be forced into brutal agricultural or mining labor. The Roman economy depended heavily on enslaved labor. Wars brought prisoners into Roman territory. Piracy and human trafficking also contributed to the slave trade. Enslaved people could come from many regions: Gaul, Thrace, Greece, Syria, North Africa, Britain, and many other parts of the Roman world. To wealthy Romans, enslaved labor could be considered an ordinary part of economic life. But there was one important possibility: manumission. An enslaved person could sometimes be freed by their owner. A freed person became a libertus or liberta. Freedom did not erase every disadvantage. Freed people had obligations to their former owners, who became their patrons. But some freedmen became extremely successful. They could own businesses. They could accumulate wealth. They could employ others. Some even became extremely rich. This created one of the most unusual features of Roman society. A person could begin life as an enslaved worker and eventually become a wealthy freedman. But social prejudice remained. Roman society cared deeply about birth and status. Money could buy comfort. It could buy influence. It could buy property. But it could not always buy respect. Romans used money everywhere. The Roman economy relied heavily on coins. The most familiar Roman denominations included the denarius, sestertius, depondius, and as. Coins were not simply pieces of metal. They were political propaganda. Look closely at a Roman coin, and you might see the face of an emperor, a military victory, a god, a temple, a symbol of prosperity. Everywhere the coins traveled, the emperor's image traveled with them. A farmer could receive a coin bearing the emperor's face. A soldier could be paid with it. A merchant could use it. A baker could accept it. A traveler could carry it hundreds of miles. The Roman monetary system connected an enormous empire. But Roman money was not worth the same thing to everyone. For a wealthy senator, a few coins might mean almost nothing. For a poor laborer, they could represent food for the family. Prices also varied depending on location and circumstances. Food could become more expensive when supplies were disrupted. Transport costs affected distant products. Luxury goods could cost enormous amounts, and wages were often modest. This meant that ordinary Romans had to think carefully about money. A worker might be paid daily. Another might receive a longer-term wage. Soldiers received regular pay, although their compensation changed over time and could include bonuses. A successful merchant could make a fortune. A poor laborer could struggle to survive. Roman society, therefore, contained enormous differences in wealth, and those differences were visible everywhere. Wealth could be extremely showy. If you were rich in ancient Rome, you had many ways to make sure everyone knew it. A wealthy Roman might own a large house, marble floors, painted walls, mosaics, fountains, gardens, statues, expensive furniture, servants, jewelry, fine clothing, and imported foods. The house itself could function as a statement of social power. But wealth was not limited to private homes. Rich Romans sponsored public buildings. They paid for statues. They financed games. They distributed food. They organized public entertainment. Why? Because generosity could create prestige. A wealthy man who spent his money on the community could gain political influence. This was known as evergetism, the practice of wealthy elites giving money or funding public projects to gain honor and strengthen their position. Imagine a Roman politician paying for a new fountain. His name could be placed on an inscription. Thousands of people would use the fountain. Every time they drank from it, they could see who had paid for it. The same could happen with temples, theaters, roads, baths, or games. In modern society, wealthy people might put their names on universities, hospitals, or stadiums. The Romans did something surprisingly similar. They understood that public generosity could become a form of advertising. But there was an even more important economic relationship in Roman society: the relationship between a patron and a client. Your connections could be worth more than money. Roman society was built around relationships. A poor man might not have much money, but if he had a powerful patron, his situation could be very different. A patron could help him find employment, support him in court, provide food, offer financial assistance, introduce him to influential people, protect his interests. In return, the client owed loyalty. The relationship could be extremely personal. Clients might visit their patron early in the morning. They might accompany him through the streets. They might support him politically. They could appear at public events. The more powerful the patron, the larger his network could become. This meant that Roman society was not simply about how much money you possessed. It was also about who you knew. A poor Roman with powerful connections might have opportunities unavailable to someone with slightly more money, but no influential allies. This system also helped politicians. A politician needed supporters. Supporters needed favors. Favors created obligations. Obligations created loyalty. And loyalty created political power. Rome's political system was therefore deeply connected to its economy. Money created influence. Influence created connections. Connections created opportunities. And opportunities created more money. For the wealthy, the system could become self-reinforcing. For the poor, escaping poverty could be extremely difficult. Rome was full of people trying to make money. The streets of Rome were constantly moving. A merchant carried goods toward the market. A baker prepared bread. A fish seller shouted about his latest catch. A blacksmith hammered metal. A porter carried heavy cargo. A money changer sat behind a counter. A craftsman worked inside his small shop. A sailor prepared to leave the harbor. A farmer arrived from the countryside with produce. Every person contributed something, and every transaction connected them to someone else. This was the hidden machine behind Rome. The emperor might sit in a palace. The Senate might debate politics. The legions might conquer new territories. But none of it mattered if food stopped arriving, if ships stopped sailing, if farmers stopped producing, if craftsmen stopped working, if merchants stopped trading. The Roman Empire was powered by ordinary people. Their work built the roads. Their hands produced the food. Their ships carried the grain. Their workshops produced the tools. Their labor maintained the enormous civilization that stretched across the Mediterranean. And yet, most of these people would never have their names remembered. We know the names of emperors: Augustus, Caesar, Nero, Trajan, Hadrian. But the millions of ordinary Romans who built their world remain mostly anonymous. They lived. They worked. They bought food. They raised children. They paid for things. They worried about money. And then they disappeared from history. But their work remained. The roads, the buildings, the pottery, the coins, the tools, the inscriptions, the ruins. All of them are evidence of the people who kept Rome alive. And tomorrow morning, the cycle would begin again. Another shop would open. Another ship would arrive. Another baker would light his oven. Another farmer would work the fields. Another merchant would count his coins. Because Rome was not built only by emperors. Rome was built by workers. A day in the life of an ancient Roman. Food and daily habits. If you wanted to understand an ancient Roman, you could start with politics. You could study the emperor. You could study the army. You could study the Senate. But there was another, much simpler way. Look at what they ate. Food was one of the most important parts of Roman life. It revealed wealth. It revealed social status. It revealed where a person lived. And sometimes, it revealed just how strange Roman culture could be. For a poor Roman, food was about survival. For a wealthy Roman, food could become entertainment. The difference between the two worlds was enormous. Bread was the foundation of Roman life. For ordinary Romans, bread was one of the most important foods. It was cheap, filling, and relatively easy to transport. But bread was not simply something people bought from a supermarket. Its production required an enormous system. Farmers grew grain. Workers harvested it. Millers processed it. Bakers turned flour into bread. Merchants transported it. And eventually, it reached the streets of Rome. Wheat was especially important. The Roman state became deeply concerned with grain supplies because a shortage of food could cause political unrest. Rome had hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, perhaps far more depending on how the population is estimated. The city could not feed itself from the surrounding countryside alone. Grain therefore arrived from across the Mediterranean. Egypt became particularly important. North Africa was also a major source. Ships carried enormous quantities of grain toward Rome. When the ships arrived, the grain entered the city's distribution system. This was one of the greatest logistical achievements of the ancient world. Think about what this meant. A person living in Rome could eat bread made from grain grown hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. The grain crossed the sea. It was loaded and unloaded, transported through ports and warehouses, milled, baked, and finally sold or distributed. The entire process depended on thousands of people, and the Romans understood exactly how important bread was. The famous political idea of bread and circuses came much later as a description of how Roman rulers could maintain popular support through food and entertainment. But the underlying reality was very real. Keep the population fed, and you reduce the risk of unrest. Wine was usually mixed with water. Wine was everywhere in Roman society. But if you traveled back in time expecting Romans to drink wine exactly as we do today, you might be surprised. Romans commonly diluted wine with water. Drinking undiluted wine could be considered excessive or even uncivilized in some contexts. Wine was a normal part of meals. It was used at banquets. It could be offered to guests. It appeared in religious ceremonies. And it was consumed by people from different levels of society. But quality varied enormously. The wealthy could afford fine wines from famous regions. Ordinary people drank cheaper varieties. Wine could also be flavored. Honey and various spices or herbs could be added. Some Roman recipes describe complex mixtures that would probably taste very unfamiliar today. For the Romans, wine was more than an alcoholic drink. It was part of culture. A Roman dinner without wine could feel incomplete. And because water quality could vary, wine and water were often combined. The idea was not simply to make the drink weaker. It was part of Mediterranean drinking culture. But Romans did have a strong awareness of drunkenness. Getting excessively drunk could damage your reputation, especially for members of the elite. A respectable Roman was expected to demonstrate self-control, at least in public. Inside private banquets, however, things could become much less restrained. Garum was everywhere. Now we reach one of the strangest Roman foods. Garum. If you lived in ancient Rome, you could encounter it constantly. Garum was a fermented fish sauce, and Romans loved it. The basic concept was simple. Small fish, fish parts, salt, and sometimes other ingredients were fermented together. The result was a strong, salty liquid. To modern people, the description can sound unpleasant. But garum was extremely valuable. It was used as a seasoning. A few drops could transform a dish. It could be added to meat, fish, vegetables, sauces, and other foods. Different varieties existed. The quality of garum could vary enormously. Some products were considered luxury goods. There were specialized production centers throughout the Roman Mediterranean. Factories produced fish sauce on a large scale. Large clay containers were used to ferment and transport it. This tells us something important about Roman cuisine. The Romans did not simply eat local food. The empire created enormous networks of trade. A person living in Rome could consume products from distant provinces. Olive oil from Spain, grain from Africa, wine from Gaul or Italy, spices from the Eastern Mediterranean, fish sauce from coastal production centers. The Roman dining table was connected to the entire empire, and garum was one of the clearest examples. It was the ancient equivalent of a product that could travel long distances because people wanted it. But garum wasn't the only unusual thing Romans consumed. The wealthy could become incredibly adventurous. Wealthy Romans loved exotic food. A wealthy Roman banquet could be a demonstration of power. The host wanted his guests to remember the meal. That meant serving food they could not easily obtain themselves. Exotic ingredients were valuable precisely because they were difficult to acquire. Peacocks could appear at elite banquets. Exotic birds, rare fish, imported fruits, expensive spices, shellfish, wild game. The point was not necessarily that these foods tasted better. Their value could come from rarity. Imagine sitting at a banquet. A servant enters carrying an enormous platter. The guests look at it. Everyone immediately understands that the host has spent a fortune. The food itself becomes a message. I can afford this. I have connections. I can obtain things ordinary people cannot. This was especially important in Roman elite society. Wealth had to be visible. A rich man who lived modestly might actually be criticized for failing to behave according to his status. Luxury could demonstrate that a person belonged among the elite. But Roman writers also criticized excessive luxury. This created a constant contradiction. Romans admired wealth, but they also praised traditional simplicity. Old Roman virtues included discipline, modesty, hard work, and self-control. The legendary early Romans were often portrayed as simple farmers. Yet centuries later, wealthy aristocrats lived in enormous houses and organized extravagant banquets. Roman society constantly argued about this contradiction. How much luxury was too much? How much food was excessive? How much money was acceptable? The answer depended heavily on who was asking. Ordinary Romans did not live like emperors. It is easy to imagine every Roman eating enormous banquets. That would be completely misleading. Most Romans were not wealthy. Their everyday food was much simpler. Grain, bread, porridge, beans, lentils, vegetables, olives, fruit, cheese, fish when available, and occasionally meat. Meat was not necessarily an everyday food for the average urban worker. The diet depended on income and location. A wealthy Roman could consume large quantities of meat and imported products. A poor family might rely heavily on grains and legumes. This difference mattered. Food was one of the clearest indicators of social class. At an elite banquet, dozens of dishes might appear. In a poor household, the meal might be a simple bowl of grain-based food. And there was another important difference. The wealthy could afford variety. The poor were much more dependent on whatever foods were affordable and available. Yet even ordinary Romans had access to foods that had traveled considerable distances. Rome's enormous trade network made certain products surprisingly widespread. Olive oil, wine, grain, salted fish, spices. The empire connected millions of people, and food moved constantly through it. Romans loved street food. You might imagine that Roman food was always served inside elegant houses. But Rome also had a thriving culture of eating outside the home. Ancient cities contained establishments known as thermopolia. These were places where hot food and drinks could be sold. For people living in cramped apartments without proper kitchens, these establishments could be extremely useful. Imagine walking through a Roman street. You are hungry. You smell something cooking. You stop. In front of you is a counter containing large ceramic containers. Inside are prepared foods. You hand over a few coins. The seller serves you a portion. You eat it there or take it away. It sounds surprisingly modern, and in some ways it was. Roman cities had an entire economy built around feeding people who were away from home. Workers, travelers, poor residents, merchants, visitors. Even wealthy Romans could eat outside occasionally. The city was full of food sellers. Bread, wine, cooked dishes, fruit, fish, meat, snacks. The Roman street was therefore not only a place for transportation. It was a place where people constantly bought and consumed things. Dinner was the most important meal. The Romans could eat several times during the day, but the main meal was generally cena. For many Romans, this was the largest meal. It could take place later in the day. For the wealthy, cena could become a formal dinner. For ordinary people, it might simply be a meal shared with family. The difference was enormous. An elite cena could include multiple courses. The host might have servants bringing food continuously. Guests could recline. Wine was served. Conversation continued. Entertainment might appear. But a poor Roman family had no reason to recreate an aristocratic banquet. Their cena could be much simpler. Perhaps bread, vegetables, legumes, a little cheese, some oil, maybe fish or meat if they could afford it. This difference tells us something important. When historians talk about Roman food, they are really talking about many different diets. There was no single Roman menu. There was the diet of the senator, the diet of the soldier, the diet of the merchant, the diet of the farmer, the diet of the slave, the diet of the urban poor. Each could be dramatically different. Romans were obsessed with status at the dinner table. Even when Romans ate together, social hierarchy remained visible. At an elite banquet, where you sat mattered. Who was invited mattered. What food you received mattered. Even the quality of the wine could communicate your importance. A powerful guest might receive the best position. A less important guest could be placed farther away. The host controlled the entire experience. This could create humiliating situations. Ancient Roman writers sometimes mocked hosts who treated guests differently, depending on their status. One famous complaint was that a wealthy host might serve excellent food to important guests while giving inferior food to less important ones. Roman authors noticed these social inequalities. They joked about them. They criticized them, and sometimes they exaggerated them for entertainment. But the fact that such stories were popular tells us something. Everyone understood the importance of status. The dinner table could become a map of Roman society. The powerful at the center, the less important around the edges, servants moving between them, everyone watching everyone else, and everyone trying to understand what their position meant. Food was therefore never just food. It was politics. It was wealth. It was reputation. It was identity, and it could even be a weapon. A host could reward you with an invitation, or humiliate you by excluding you. A politician could organize a public feast. A wealthy citizen could distribute food to gain popularity. An emperor could provide grain to prevent unrest. The Romans understood something that governments throughout history would learn again and again. People may tolerate many things, but they rarely tolerate hunger for long. And this brings us to the next part of Roman life. After working, eating, shopping, and socializing, Romans needed somewhere to relax. And nowhere was more important than the bathhouse. In the next chapter, we will enter the great Roman baths. We will see how people exercised, socialized, groomed themselves, and spent hours surrounded by thousands of other people. Because for the Romans, the bath was never just a bath. A day in the life of an ancient Roman. Baths, entertainment, and social life. By late afternoon, the working day in ancient Rome was beginning to slow down. The shops were still open. The streets were still crowded. But for many Romans, another part of the day was beginning. This was the time to meet friends, to exercise, to gossip, to relax, to watch entertainment, and perhaps most importantly, to go to the baths. For modern people, a bathroom is usually a private place. For the Romans, bathing could be almost the opposite. It was public, it was social, and it was one of the most important parts of urban life. The Roman bath was like a social club. Imagine walking through the streets of Rome and approaching an enormous building. You hear voices from inside. People are talking. Others are exercising. Some are laughing. Some are negotiating business deals. Others are simply relaxing. You have arrived at the baths. The Roman bathhouse was not simply a place where people washed. Large complexes could contain multiple rooms, pools, exercise areas, gardens, and other facilities. Some imperial bath complexes were enormous. The baths of Caracalla, for example, could accommodate thousands of visitors. For many Romans, visiting the baths was part of their normal routine. You could meet friends there. You could hear the latest political rumors. You could discuss business. You could find clients. You could meet potential business partners. You could simply spend time away from your cramped home. In a city where many ordinary people lived in crowded apartment buildings, the baths provided something extremely valuable: space. The baths were also a place where different social classes could come into contact. That did not mean everyone was equal. Roman society remained strongly hierarchical, but the bathhouse brought large numbers of people into the same environment, and that made it one of the most socially important places in the city. Romans exercised before they bathed. Bathing often began with exercise. Roman bath complexes could include areas for physical activity. Men might wrestle, run, play ball games, or perform other forms of exercise. The purpose was partly practical. Exercise caused the body to sweat, and sweat could then be removed during the bathing process. For Romans, physical fitness was connected to ideals of masculinity and discipline. The ideal Roman male was expected to be strong, capable, and self-controlled. Military culture reinforced these values. But exercise could also simply be enjoyable. Not everyone who went to the baths was preparing for war. Some were there because they enjoyed physical activity. Others wanted to socialize. After exercise, the visitor could move toward the heated rooms. And this is where Roman engineering became especially impressive. Romans had underfloor heating. One of the most remarkable technologies inside Roman bathhouses was the hypocaust. The basic idea was surprisingly clever. Instead of heating a room with a fireplace inside it, Romans could heat the floor from underneath. A furnace produced hot air. The hot air moved through a space beneath the floor. It could also travel through specially designed spaces in the walls. The result was a heated building. This system required enormous amounts of fuel. Wood had to be transported and burned continuously. Workers had to maintain the furnaces. The entire system had to be carefully managed. But the result could be extraordinary. Imagine entering a Roman bath complex on a cold day. Outside, Rome is noisy and dusty. Inside, warm air surrounds you. The stone floor is heated. Steam fills the hot rooms. Water flows through pools. The walls are decorated with marble and mosaics. For an ancient person, this could feel incredibly luxurious. And for the Roman state, massive baths were also a demonstration of technological power. An emperor could build a bath complex so enormous that ordinary citizens could walk through halls decorated with expensive stone and statues. The message was obvious. Rome was rich. Rome was powerful. And the emperor could provide comfort on a gigantic scale. Romans scraped oil from their skin. Now comes one of the strangest parts of the Roman bathing routine. Romans often used oil instead of modern soap. After exercising, a person could apply oil to the skin. The oil mixed with sweat and dirt. Then the mixture was removed with a curved instrument called a strigil. The strigil was usually made of metal. It had a curved shape that allowed the user to scrape substances from the skin. A bath attendant could help wealthy customers. The process might sound unpleasant to us, but to Romans, it was normal. The strigil became an important part of bathing culture. People could purchase oils and perfumes. They could have attendants help them. They could groom themselves. And they could spend considerable time preparing their appearance. Roman society placed great importance on appearance. Hair, clothing, skin, perfume, jewelry. All of these could communicate wealth and status. The baths were therefore partly about cleanliness and partly about presentation. You were not simply cleaning your body. You were preparing yourself to return to society. The baths were full of gossip. Imagine sitting beside a pool surrounded by dozens of people. Someone is talking about a politician. Another person is discussing a business deal. Someone else is telling a story about a neighbor. A merchant is negotiating with a customer. A young man is trying to impress his friends. And somewhere nearby, an elderly Roman is complaining about how terrible the younger generation has become. The baths were perfect places for gossip. People had time. They were relaxed. And everyone knew everyone. Roman writers frequently complained about gossip, rumors, and public conversation. In a city this large, information traveled quickly. A rumor could begin in one neighborhood and spread throughout the city. The baths helped create these networks, but they could also be useful for business. A merchant might meet a potential partner. A politician could encounter supporters. A client could approach his patron. A wealthy Roman could strengthen social connections. The bathhouse was therefore part gymnasium, part spa, part social club, and part networking center. And sometimes, it could be dangerous. Because where large numbers of people gathered, conflict was inevitable. Arguments could begin. Insults could escalate. And Roman society had a very strong culture of honor. An insult was not always something you simply ignored. Romans loved gambling. Baths were not the only way Romans entertained themselves. Gambling was extremely popular. Romans played dice. They bet money. They played board games. And they sometimes gambled despite laws restricting certain forms of betting. Dice were particularly common. Small objects. Simple rules. But enormous possibilities. A person could win or lose everything. Roman writers frequently mentioned gambling, especially when criticizing people who became obsessed with it. The problem was not simply the game. It was the money. A wealthy person could lose enormous sums. A poor person could gamble money that his family needed. And yet gambling remained popular. The excitement was obvious. You throw the dice. They bounce across the table. Everyone waits. Then they stop. For a moment, your entire evening depends on a few pieces of bone or stone. The Romans understood that feeling very well. But gambling was only one form of entertainment. If you wanted something much bigger, you went to the arena. The arena was Rome's biggest entertainment. Few places represented Roman culture more dramatically than the amphitheater. The most famous example is the Colosseum. Its official name was the Flavian Amphitheater. When it opened in the 1st century AD, it became one of the greatest entertainment venues in the Roman world. Tens of thousands of spectators could gather there. They came to watch gladiatorial combat, animal hunts, public spectacles, and other forms of entertainment. The crowd could be enormous. People arrived early. They found their assigned seating areas. The wealthiest spectators sat closest to the action. The social hierarchy of Rome was literally built into the architecture. Your seat told everyone who you were. The emperor occupied the most prestigious position. Senators had their own area. Other social groups had designated sections. Even in entertainment, Roman society remained organized by status. And then the show began. Trumpets sounded. The crowd roared. Gladiators entered the arena. Some were highly trained professionals. Others were prisoners, enslaved people, or condemned criminals. Not every gladiatorial fight ended in death. Gladiators were valuable. Training them required time and money. A successful gladiator could become famous. Some earned money. Some gained popularity. A few became genuine celebrities. Their names were known throughout the city. Graffiti found at Roman sites shows that ordinary people could follow gladiatorial careers with enthusiasm. In that sense, gladiators were ancient celebrities. People knew who they were. They discussed their victories. They admired their strength. They argued about who would win. But the arena was also a demonstration of Roman power. The state controlled the spectacle. The emperor could provide entertainment for the population, and thousands of people would gather to watch. The arena reminded everyone that Rome could command enormous resources. Romans also loved chariot racing. If gladiators were famous, charioteers could become superstars. Chariot racing was one of the most popular forms of entertainment in the Roman world. The main venue in Rome was the Circus Maximus. It was enormous. Its size allowed massive crowds to gather. The races were fast, dangerous, and unpredictable. Chariots raced around the track at high speed. Crashes were common. Horses could collide. Chariots could overturn. Drivers could be thrown onto the track. The crowd loved it. Roman racing teams developed enormous followings. Fans supported different factions. They could wear associated colors. They could celebrate victories. They could insult rival teams. The emotional intensity could be extraordinary. It was not simply sport. It was identity. People could become deeply attached to their faction, and successful charioteers could become extremely famous. Some accumulated significant wealth. This was one of the few worlds where someone from a relatively low social position could achieve enormous public fame. But fame could disappear quickly. One crash could end a career. Another could end a life. Romans went to the theater. Not all Roman entertainment involved violence. The Romans also enjoyed theater. Plays could include comedy, tragedy, music, dance, and performance. Roman theaters were often large and architecturally impressive. The audience could be enormous. Actors performed before crowds while musicians accompanied the action. Comedy was especially popular. Roman playwrights adapted many ideas from Greek theater. The Roman world admired Greek culture and borrowed extensively from it. But Roman audiences developed their own tastes. Comedy could be crude. Political jokes could appear. Social stereotypes were common. Theater allowed Romans to laugh at the world around them, and sometimes to laugh at themselves. But there was another form of entertainment that required no special building at all. Conversation. Romans loved talking. Social life was everything. For many Romans, life revolved around other people. You visited relatives. You greeted patrons. You met friends. You went shopping. You visited the baths. You attended religious ceremonies. You watched games. You went to dinner. You went to the theater. You walked through the city. There was always somewhere to go. Always someone to meet. Always something happening. This is one reason Roman cities could feel so intense. The streets were crowded. Buildings were packed together. Shops opened directly onto sidewalks. Vendors shouted. Animals moved through the streets. People argued. Children played. Workers carried goods. Officials moved through crowds. The city never completely became silent. Even at night, Rome could remain active. For someone accustomed to a quiet modern suburb, ancient Rome would probably feel overwhelming. But Romans were accustomed to it. Noise was normal. Crowds were normal. Public life was normal. Privacy was a luxury. And this tells us something important about Roman culture. The Roman ideal was not isolation. It was participation. You were expected to know people, to maintain relationships, to appear in public, to show your status, to participate in religious and social events, to be seen. Because in Roman society, being invisible could mean losing influence. Your reputation existed in the eyes of other people. And so Romans spent enormous amounts of time managing that reputation. They dressed carefully. They chose their friends carefully. They attended public events. They gave gifts. They hosted dinners. They greeted patrons. They supported politicians. They watched races. They cheered for gladiators. They visited the baths. They talked. They argued. They laughed. They lived their lives surrounded by other people. And eventually, the sun began to disappear over Rome. The shops closed. The crowds changed. Torches began appearing in the streets. But nighttime in Rome was not peaceful. The city had another side. A darker side. Fires. Crime. Thieves. Noise. Drunken crowds. And dangerous streets. In the final part, we will discover what happened when Rome went dark. How did ordinary Romans light their homes? Why were the streets so dangerous? How did people sleep in crowded apartment buildings? And what happened when one of Rome's greatest fears suddenly became reality? Night was coming to Rome. And for many Romans, that was when the real danger began.